This is lesson 3 in the series, Another Look at Divorce and Remarriage. In the last class, I finished up looking at the Lord's teaching in Matthew chapter 5, verses 31 and 32. Today I begin with Matthew chapter 19. The groundwork that was laid in the discussion of Matthew chapter 5, 31 and 32 should expedite the discussion of the additional text in the Gospels. After looking at the Gospel texts, I'll consider two texts from the Apostle Paul. Matthew chapter 19, verses 3 to 9 states, "And Pharisees came up to him and tested him by asking, 'Is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause?' He answered, 'Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother, and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh? So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate.' They said to him, 'Why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and to send her away?' He said to them, 'Because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery.'" As I explained in lesson 1, in Matthew chapter 19, Jesus was, in essence, asked by the Pharisees whether he agreed with the Hillelites that Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 1 permitted divorce for any reason. And they did so to test him, meaning they asked the question to elicit an answer that they hoped would be detrimental to him, as when the Pharisee in Matthew chapter 22, verses 34 to 36, tested Jesus by asking him which is the great commandment in the law. He was hoping that Jesus would respond in a way that damaged his esteem as a teacher. The Pharisees in Matthew 19:3, they wanted to put Jesus' view of divorce on the record in the hope of alienating at least part of his audience. When Jesus makes clear that God intended from the beginning for marriage to be permanent, as you see in verses 4 through 6 and verse 8, they think they've caught him contradicting Scripture, and thus challenge him with, "Why then did Moses command to give a certificate of divorce and thus to divorce her?" They were suggesting that the fact God provided for divorce contradicts the claim that he intended marriage to be permanent. And Jesus explains in verse 8 that the permission to divorce that is implicit in Deuteronomy 24:1 is not inconsistent with his assertion that God intended from the beginning for marriage to be permanent. Rather, it was a concession God made because of the hardness of their hearts, a concession that goes contrary to his desire and ideal. Jesus makes clear in chapter 19, verse 9, that the Shammaites' understanding of Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 1 is essentially the correct one. But he doesn't confine his answer to the narrow debate over the meaning of Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 1. By universalizing his answer, declaring whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality, porneia, he makes clear that no divorces between Christians are beyond the restriction. Wayne Grudem comments, "The construction, whoever except for, explicitly rules out all the grounds for divorce other than adultery. It is not just that Jesus failed to explicitly deny that divorce was valid for failure to provide food, clothing, or marital rights. He also failed to explicitly deny that divorce was valid for a wife spoiling a meal or because a man found another woman whom he thought more beautiful than his present wife. He did not need to deny any of these explicitly, because he was denying them all at once when he said, "Whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality." I say Jesus made clear that no divorces between Christians are beyond the restriction to sexual immorality, because the Spirit later revealed to the Apostle Paul, you see in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 12 and 13, that Jesus was here speaking of marriages between two believers. He was not addressing marriages between believers and unbelievers, between covenant people and those outside the covenant. Jesus reveals in Matthew 19, verse 9, that the husband who impermissibly divorces his wife, who divorces her for a reason other than sexual infidelity, he's prohibited from marrying another woman. That would be metaphorical adultery on his part, a violation of a maritally created duty not to marry another that Jesus indicates survives dissolution of the marriage. If he divorces her because of her sexual infidelity, he doesn't commit adultery in marrying another woman. A divorce for sexual immorality extinguishes any duty owed to that spouse not to marry another. The disciples' reaction and Jesus' response are reported in chapter 19, verses 10 to 12. It says, "The disciples said to him, 'If such is the case of a man with his wife, it is better not to marry.' But he said to them, 'Not everyone can receive this saying, but only those to whom it is given. For there are eunuchs who have been so from birth, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by men, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let the one who is able to receive this receive it.'" The disciples in verse 10, they react to Jesus' teaching in verse 9 with the statement, "If such is the case of a man with his wife, it is better not to marry." They do so because Jesus taught, contrary to the dominant Jewish understanding of the day, that a husband could divorce his wife only for sexual unfaithfulness, and if he divorced her for some other reason, he was not free to marry someone else. He thus raised the marriage stakes for his disciples. They were to treat the marriage relationship not in keeping with current Jewish understanding and practices, but according to the demands of the new covenant, which were more in line with God's original elevation of marriage. In Matthew 19:11, Jesus picks up on the disciples' comment in verse 10 that it is better not to marry. And he tells them cryptically, "Not everyone can receive this saying, but only those to whom it is given." There's an element of truth in what the disciples had just uttered. It is better not to marry if one will not treat the marriage covenant in accordance with its sanctity, as expressed by what Jesus just said about it, but as an abstract or blanket statement. It fails to recognize that it's true only regarding those to whom it is uniquely applicable, those who by God's grace can handle a life of celibacy. He explains in verse 12 that some cannot experience sexual relations because of some birth defect, those born eunuchs. Some cannot experience sexual relations because they've been castrated, those made eunuchs by men. And some cannot experience sexual relations because they've chosen not to marry to devote themselves to ministry. Those made eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Giving up a right to marry is not for everyone, but only for those who by God's gift can handle it. You recall Paul's remark in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 7, where he wished that all people had his gift of freedom from the need for sexual fulfillment that made it possible for him to live unmarried. So before they casually write off marriage as something Jesus' teaching makes too difficult, they must judge whether they are among those who can live without it. I think that's what the Lord is telling them. Mark chapter 10, verses 2 to 12 states, "And Pharisees came up, and in order to test him asked, 'Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife?' He answered them, 'What did Moses command you?' They said, 'Moses allowed a man to write a certificate of divorce and to send her away.' And Jesus said to them, 'Because of your hardness of heart he wrote you this commandment. But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate.' And in the house, the disciples asked him again about this matter. And he said to them, 'Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery.'" Now, Mark does not report that Jesus told the Pharisees whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. But he transmits the teaching in Jesus' subsequent instruction of the disciples. After Jesus' exchange with the Pharisees, the disciples ask him about the subject again in private. And in the course of that discussion, Jesus repeated for them what Matthew reveals he had said to the Pharisees. "Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery." Now, Mark omits the Matthean exception of divorce for sexual infidelity, perhaps because the exceptional nature of that offense as an assault on the marital union was universally understood and therefore didn't need to be mentioned. In other words, it went without saying. Jesus stated it because he was answering in the context of the debate between the disciples of Hillel and Shammai about the meaning of Ervat Debar in Deuteronomy 24:1. But the focus of his teaching was on God's original intent that marriage be permanent. In wanting to highlight that focus, Mark may have felt that including the exception, especially given that the exception would be assumed, he may have thought that including it would be a distraction for his Gentile audience. Matthew may have reported it, may have included Jesus making the exception, because he wanted to make it more difficult for any among his initial Jewish audience to misrepresent Jesus. Now, Mark makes express what was implied in Matthew chapter 19, verse 9, that the adultery a man commits upon divorcing his wife on impermissible grounds and marrying another, that adultery is against her. It is against the divorced wife. And he also records that Jesus addressed the issue of women divorcing their husbands. Now that's curious, because divorce in first century Israel was an action that only the husband could take. Perhaps Jesus is referring to cases in which the wife was the de facto initiator of a divorce, even though her husband was the one who technically accomplished it. Instone Brewer says, divorce in first century Israel was enacted by the man, though a court could persuade a man to enact a divorce when his wife demonstrated that she had sufficient grounds for a divorce. Indeed, Exodus chapter 21, verses 10 and 11, was widely interpreted to justify a wife seeking to compel her husband to divorce her where he had failed to provide her with necessary food or clothing. In addition, Jewish wives could engineer divorces less formally by acting to drive their husbands to divorce them. Jesus may frame those situations as a wife divorcing her husband because he had his eye on the broader world into which the church would expand. Now, the sum of Mark chapter 10, verses 11 and 12, considering all that's been said, is that if the husband divorces his wife for any reason other than sexual immorality, the Matthean exception being assumed, the surviving maritally created duty not to marry another remains mutual, so he commits metaphorical adultery by remarriage. If the wife divorces her husband for any reason other than sexual immorality, the Matthean exception being assumed for women, the surviving maritally created duty not to marry another remains mutual, so she commits metaphorical adultery by remarriage, as would the husband. Luke chapter 16, verse 18. Jesus says, anyone who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery. And the man who marries a woman who has been divorced from her husband commits adultery. In Luke chapter 16, verse 9, Jesus concludes the parable of the unjust steward with a call to live in accordance with the ethics of the kingdom by being generous with one's wealth. He expands on the point in verses 10 through 13, ending with his famous declaration, "You cannot serve God and money." The Pharisees, who were lovers of money, we see in verse 14, ridiculed him for this teaching. And Jesus told them in verse 15 that though they justify themselves before men, twist the scriptures to make their greed seem acceptable. An example being in Matthew chapter 15, verses 3 to 6. Though they do that, God knows their hearts. The reason they must justify themselves before men, the reason they must force the scriptures into line with their greed is because the two don't fit together naturally. Indeed, the two are opposed to one another. The riches that are exalted among men are an idolatrous abomination in the sight of God. In Luke 16, verses 16 and 17, Jesus notes that his ministry, which was launched by the ministry of John the Baptist, his ministry is a turning point in salvation history, the dawning of the kingdom of God. But the introduction of that kingdom does not void or repudiate the law. Rather, it brings the law's ethical requirements to full expression. The loose divorce standards of the dominant Hillelite school, which serve the interests of greed by allowing husbands to dismiss their wives for any reason to marry women of greater wealth and standing. Those were contrary to the purpose and intent of the law as expressed by Jesus, the fulfiller of that law. Anyone who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery, and the man who marries a woman who has been divorced from her husband commits adultery. As in Matthew 19:9 and Mark chapter 10 verse 11, if the husband divorces his wife for any reason other than sexual infidelity, the Matthean exception being assumed, the surviving maritally created duty not to marry another remains mutual, so he commits metaphorical adultery by remarriage. As in Matthew 5:32b, a man who marries a woman who has been divorced by her husband, as distinct from her having divorced her husband. A man who marries a woman who has been divorced by her husband is party to her breach of her continuing duty not to marry another, so he too is guilty of metaphorical adultery. The Matthean exception is not mentioned, presumably for the same reason it was not mentioned in Mark's account. Now I want to look at some texts from the Apostle Paul. For this class, I'll just look at two. We have some more to go there. But the first is Romans chapter 7, verses 1 to 4, which reads, "Or do you not know, brothers, for I speak to those who know the law, that the law exercises lordship over a person for as long a time as he lives. For the married woman has been bound to her living husband by the law, but if the husband should die, she has been released from the law of the husband. Now therefore, while the husband is living, she will be called an adulteress if she comes to belong to another man. But if the husband should die, she is free from the law, so that she is not an adulteress after coming to belong to another man. So, my brothers, you also were put to death to the law through the body of Christ, so that you might come to belong to another, to the one who was raised from the dead, so that we might bear fruit to God." Paul said in Romans chapter 6, verse 14, that Christians are not under the law. And then he immediately, in verses 15 through 23, explained that this fact does not lead to sin. He now elaborates on the assertion that Christians are not under the law. His real targets may be those Roman Christians who believed that the Mosaic law was still applicable to Christians. And though the Roman Christians generally, they would have been familiar with the Mosaic law, those urging its ongoing applicability, they would have been especially identified with the Mosaic law. They would have been considered and would have considered themselves the most knowledgeable about that law. Well, Paul asked if those with knowledge of the law, speaking to this group, I think, he asked if they're ignorant of the fact that the Mosaic law, like law in general, applied only to the living. A rabbinic saying, which may have been known at this time, was, if a person is dead, he's free from the Torah and the fulfilling of the commandments. Paul then illustrates that principle with a reference to the marriage relationship. The death of a wife's husband freed her from the law's obligation regarding her husband, so that she was free to remarry. You see, for example, in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 3, and in the cases of levirate marriage. If, however, she came to belong to another man while her husband was still alive, she would be called an adulteress. That is, she would still be under the law of the husband. Now, Paul's statement in verse 3 that a wife who came to belong to another man while her husband was still alive would be called an adulteress, that statement is not referring to remarriage to another after a divorce. He's not speaking of Christ's teaching on divorce and remarriage, which prohibited remarriage after most divorces. But he's providing an illustration of the effect of death under the Mosaic law. And under that law, it was uniformly agreed that a woman who remarried after a divorce was not an adulteress. Now, since Paul assumes that those especially knowledgeable about the Mosaic law who were urging its ongoing applicability, he assumes they agree the woman will be called an adulteress in the case in question. He assumes they're with him on that. He clearly isn't talking about a divorcee because they would not agree with that. You see? Rather, he's simply saying that a woman who joins with another man while she's still married to a living husband is an adulteress, whereas the same conduct would not warrant that label if her husband had died. That's his point. Douglas Moo, in his commentary on Romans, he explains it this way. These verses are sometimes cited to prove that remarriage on any basis other than the death of one's spouse is adulterous. Whether this is the biblical teaching or not, these verses at any rate are probably not relevant to the issue. Paul is not teaching about remarriage, but citing a simple example to prove a point. In such a situation, one often generalizes to what is usually true in order to simplify the analogy. Since Paul does not mention divorce, one can assume that the remarriage of the woman has taken place without a divorce of any kind, and any such remarriage is, of course, adulterous. Further, any body of law that Paul may be citing, Roman or Old Testament, allows for remarriage on grounds other than the death of the spouse. His readers who know the law would certainly recognize this possibility without it in any way spoiling the effectiveness of Paul's analogy. So I think it's just a mistake to take this text up in the discussion of divorce and remarriage. The point is that just as the wife was freed to be joined to another by her husband's death, so those championing the Mosaic law had been freed to be joined to Christ by sharing through baptism in the death of Christ. The purpose of this union with Christ was that they might bear fruit to God. Paul isn't concerned that in the illustration the wife is freed from the law by her husband's death rather than by her own death. The point is that death removes legal obligations. In addition, the fact the wife remains alive, having been freed from the law by the death of another, that allows her to be used for the additional point, she's free to belong to another, as believers are free by their death to the law through Christ to belong to another and bear fruit to God. Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 10 and 11. I'd mentioned this before. I'm going to say a bit more about it now. The text says, "Now to the married I command, not I, but the Lord, the wife not to separate from her husband, but if she does indeed separate, let her remain unmarried, or be reconciled to the husband, and the husband not to divorce his wife." The Corinthian church was infected by what is known in theological terms as over-realized eschatology, meaning that some were reading the now too much in terms of the not yet, applying to present existence things that would not be true until the eternal state. That perspective gave rise to the claim that abstaining from sex within marriage was justified, was the right choice, the right course for those in this new age of the Spirit in chapter 7, verses 1 to 5. And some took the notion so far as to contend it justified dissolving marriages altogether. That's the claim that Paul denies in chapter 7, verses 10 and 11. In 7, 10, and 11, Paul addresses the situation in which both partners were Christians. As Gordon Fee says, in speaking to the married, Paul is presupposing in this first instance that both partners are believers. This is made certain by what follows next, verses 12 to 16, where, in a way that balances with the present set, 9 and 10, he addresses the rest, whom that context defines as believers married to unbelievers. Referring expressly to the Lord's teaching, Paul declares that a Christian wife must not divorce her Christian husband, and a Christian husband must not divorce his Christian wife. E.P. Sanders observes, the historicity of Jesus prohibiting divorce is confirmed by Paul's giving it as a commandment, not from himself, but from the Lord, that neither the wife should divorce the husband, nor the husband the wife. Now, Paul does not mention the exception for divorces for sexual immorality because it wasn't relevant to the divorce issue he was addressing in Corinth, which involved the propriety of divorce on spiritual or ascetic grounds. They weren't talking about divorcing for sexual immorality. They were saying in this new age of the Spirit, the right course for us to take as these new enlightened people is to dissolve the marriages for spiritual or ascetic reasons. Now, the word that Paul uses for the wife divorcing her husband, is chorizo. It's chorizo. It's the same word in Matthew chapter 19, verse 6, and Mark chapter 10, verse 9, which undisputedly is a command not to dissolve the marriage bond, not to separate what God has joined together. Joseph Fitzmyer, a famous Catholic scholar, he observes, in this verse, Paul uses chorizo, the verb that commonly means divorce in classical and Hellenistic Greek writers, as well as in Greek marriage contracts. And the word unquestionably has that meaning in these verses because Paul specifies in verse 11 that it rendered the parties unmarried. As J. Paul Sampley notes, Paul counsels any woman who does separate to remain unmarried. So Paul himself treats chorizo as an actual termination of the marriage. Chorizo also refers to dissolution of a marriage. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 15, where it frees the spouse from the bond of marriage. Thomas Schreiner states, the word for separate, chorizo, here is often used in the papyri to signify divorce. Hence, English readers must beware of reading the modern Western conception of separation into the verse. Paul is not thinking of a period of separation before a divorce ensues. Rather, he directs a wife not to divorce her husband. For the husband divorcing, Paul uses a synonymous term, aphiemi. As John Meyer points out, various Greek verbs like aphiemi and charizomai and apoluo in the synoptics take on the technical meaning to divorce when used in a specific context. Instone Brewer says, there were more than 50 words used for divorce in Greek marriage and divorce contracts, and it was common to use several in a single document. It is certainly not possible to say that aphiemi is a legal divorce and charizo is just a separation. David Garland says, in the context of Greco-Roman practice, the verb charizo means to divorce and is synonymous with the verb aphieni in 7:11b, which Paul uses to command the husband not to send away his wife. William Loader remarks, the two verbs should not be differentiated, as if one refers to separation and the other to formal divorce. Raymond Collins, in his book on divorce and remarriage, he says, both charizo, separate, and aphiemi, divorce, used by Paul in 1 Corinthians 7:10 through 16, were, however, commonly used of divorce in the Hellenistic world. Herodotus and other ancient authors had used aphiemi to mean divorce. In classical and Hellenistic Greek, the verb charizo was also often used of divorce in the strict sense, even in Greek marriage contracts. The use of charizo, separate, in this way was so common that in their lexicon of New Testament vocabulary, Moulton and Milligan state that charizo, quote, has almost become a technical term in connection with divorce, end quote, offering papyri dating from 13 BC, 66 AD, 81 AD, and 154 AD as their principal references, and citing 1 Corinthians 7:10, 11, 15 as cases in point. In sum, both charizo, separate, and aphiemi, divorce, appear to have functioned as technical terms for divorce in Paul's Hellenistic world. Thus, the attempt to draw a sharp and fully adequate semantic distinction between charizo, separate, and aphiemi, divorce is unwarranted. Such a distinction is artificial and not supported by contemporary linguistic usage and is clearly forced insofar as 1 Corinthians 7:10 to 16 is concerned. Now in verse 11, Paul adds that if, despite the command against it, a Christian wife does in fact divorce her Christian husband, she must remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. She cannot marry someone else. Jesus taught that divorce is permitted for Christians only where one's spouse has been sexually immoral. And since the Christian wife under discussion here has divorced wrongfully, meaning divorced for some reason other than her husband's sexual immorality, she has divorced for some spiritual or ascetic notion, she is, according to the Lord's teaching, not free to remarry. That's why Paul says her choices are to remain unmarried or to reconcile with the husband she had impermissibly divorced. Now, if she does remarry, she clearly has sinned in doing so, has committed metaphorical adultery. But what is the status of that second marriage given her divorce? Now, Paul doesn't address this directly. I'll say more about it later when I address some common questions that arise. But here, as a spoiler, let me just say that it seems to me that the second marriage is in fact an actual marriage, a genuine marriage, despite being wrongful, as the marriages in Ezra chapters 9 and 10 were actual marriages, despite being wrongful, despite having been entered into contrary to the will of God. See, so just as the woman's impermissible, her wrongful divorce, just as that was effective to sever the marriage bond, to render her unmarried, despite the fact it was contrary to God's will, so her wrongful marriage, I think, creates a marriage bond, despite being contrary to the Lord's will. I'll have more to say about that. So that's the end of this lesson. Don't know when I'll get to the next one, but thanks for hanging in.